Hello, this is Mike Smith. Welcome back to another Maya tutorial. This time I'll be explaining materials inside Maya. Now, by default, you have one material on every object you make. That material is called Lambert, and you'll find if you looked in your attribute editor, you'll see some basic settings. So let's open the attribute editor up. In the top right corner of the screen, just click on the folder icon, and if we select any one of our objects, I'll go ahead and select this one in the middle, and then if you look in your attribute editor, if we look at these tabs along the top and scroll all the way along to the right, you'll see you've got your Lambert 1, and if we click on that, you'll see some basic settings. Now, before we adjust any of those, a Lambert is non-reflective, it's not shiny, and it doesn't have what we call a specular. So there's no highlight on the object. In this scene, I've got no lights, it's just got the default light you find in any scene. And if I rotate around, you'll see there's no real highlight on these objects. So if you want something that's matte, that's not shiny, that isn't reflective, a Lambert is ideal. And one thing that's important to understand is every object has that same material by default. So if you go and adjust one of these objects, so if I look in the attribute editor here and adjust the colour, if I just move this slider, you'll see every object will be adjusted. You're not just manipulating the material on this selected object, you're adjusting the material it contains. So where every object has that Lambert 1, you're adjusting really every object. So what you'd need to do, unless you want to adjust everything, is first assign a new material onto this. So if you right click and scroll down to assign new material, you'll have lots of different options. Now you'll need to make sure to access some of these, you need to make sure you've got your Mental Ray plugin activated. I've explained that in quite a few other tutorials, so you might have to look back over those if you've forgotten how to do that. But for now, we can have a look at just some of these basic ones. I won't have time to explain all of them, but I'll just explain how to apply them and some basic settings on there. A very common one I like quite a lot, is this one here called Blinn. If I click on that, a Blinn material is quite flexible. You can make it non-reflective like a Lambert, or you can make it very metallic like a polished silver or even a gold material. And we can do that just by looking in the attribute editor again. First of all, it's a very good idea to retitle your material. I'll just go ahead and call this Material 1 for this tutorial, simply because I don't have any specific objects made. So you might want to have a think about what you want to call it. If you want to go for a silver or a gold or a bronze material, then call it something more appropriate. So once you've called it a name, just press enter, and then we can start having a look at these settings. Now you have your colour here, and you'll find when you adjust that now, it just adjusts the material that this object has. And you can change the colour completely by clicking on the colour box, and you get loads more options. So I could go ahead and click on a green, for example. And you have, without going into too much detail on all of these, your transparency is quite straightforward. You can make it see-through or transparent. But if we have a look down here at specular shading, now if I zoom in on this object a bit more, just use my select tool just so my arrows disappear, you can see you have your specular, which is just the highlight. If I go back onto my material in my attribute editor, back down to specular shading, you can change the specular colour, and I can reduce that and you'll see on my object it looks now quite matte, but if I go up it becomes more shiny. And you can really adjust that any way you like. You'll have to do some test renders if you've got some lighting in there as well. And you can also adjust the reflectivity. Now we'll see that when we do some renders in a few minutes. But along with the specular colour, we have what we call the eccentricity. And the eccentricity, if I move that, you'll see it adjusts how spread out and how sharp our specular is. So if you have a low eccentricity and a very high specular, I'll just click off this object so you can see it in its non-wireframe form, you'll see you get a very sharp, shiny looking material there. If I do the opposite, if I increase the eccentricity but lower the specular, you get a much less shiny, more perhaps a painted surface, a much less glossy surface. And that's really just fine adjustments on these two attributes. And it's a good idea when you're new to this, make a note of some of these settings. Screenshot this if you like, and just make a note of when you actually created that screenshot if it doesn't do it automatically. Perhaps put it in your project folder if that helps too. And there's loads more different settings on here. Feel free to experiment. I won't go through every single detail on those because it will take days and days to explain. So just experiment in your own time and make a note of what it is you do. So a blend is a good one just to get used to some of the basic settings, and you can even do a quick render just to see how that looks with the default lights. Make sure you render in mental ray for some of these materials. So you can see there the specular doesn't really show up. Okay, so we can adjust that. We could perhaps increase the specular colour and then re-render that. There you go, so you've got some kind of highlight here. It's quite spread out because our eccentricity is quite high. If I lower that, and you'll see as you adjust this, you actually get a preview or a sample at the top of your attribute editor. So you'll see as I adjust that, that sample does change. You might find that a bit quicker than re-rendering all the time, but the best way really is just to render this on a low resolution. The render settings adjust the default values, the default resolution. There you go, you can see the specular is much more apparent. It's sharper, so it looks like it's a more glossy material. And now we can have a look at these reflections. So you can see by default the blend is quite reflective. It's easy to adjust, self-explanatory, just reflectivity there. You can reduce that. So if I go down to maybe 0.1 and then re-render this, I'll just re-render a section so you can see. There you go, it's much less reflective there. Now, one big tip with this, like my lighting tutorial if you've watched that already, is just do one material at a time. Experiment with settings on one of them, title it, save your scene, and then carry on applying different materials. Otherwise you'll find it will take you forever adjusting your reflectivity, your speculars of all these different materials. And once we've got one of them right, you'll find if you wanted to actually apply that to a different object, you don't have to recreate it. You can simply right click on a different object and then scroll down to either assign favourite material, and it will have some of your favourite ones on here, or if you go to existing material, it will come up with whatever you've titled it. So in this case, material 1, and it will assign that material on there. And because these now have exactly the same material, if you did adjust one of them, so if I go back into my attribute editor and click on that material 1 tab, if I adjusted one of these it will actually adjust both because they have exactly the same material, so just bear that in mind. You're not adjusting the object, you're adjusting the material. And some other good ones that are worth playing around with, if I just select both these objects, and I'll go back to the Lambda 1 for now, so right click, I'll go back to assign existing, Lambda 1. One really useful material, make sure you're rendering in mental ray, so make sure your plugin's activated, and you'll need some kind of light in here. I'll show you why soon. But a really good material is one called Mir Material X, and that's fantastic for quite metallic materials. So if you're looking at creating anything like a silver cup, maybe a fork, some kind of blade, an arrow or a spear, the Mir Material X is perfect. So select an object, right click, assign new material, and if we scroll down here, you'll see you've got lots more presets, and there really are loads to choose from. And Mir Material X is right here. If I click on that, your object will just apply a grey for now. We need to actually go into the attribute editor and make some adjustments. So, like I did before, I'll retitle that. So first of all, click on the tab in your attribute editor, Mir Material X1, and I'll call this one bronze. So I want this to be quite a yellowy orange bronze looking material, and you'll find with the Mir Material X you've got lots of different attributes here to play around with. Most of them are quite self-explanatory: reflectiveness, glossiness. It even tells you, if you hold the mouse over it, it tells you a bit about that setting so you can get used to what they are. Like I said before, if you make adjustments, screenshot it, make a note of what you're doing, just so if something goes wrong you can at least backtrack and work out what's happened, and for future reference. But the thing I really want to show you with the Mir Material X is the presets here. If you click and hold on presets, you've got loads of basic preset materials here. So if I wanted something bronze, I could click on perhaps the nearest one to it, which might be this copper material. So go to copper. I want to replace all the current attributes with the copper attributes. Doesn't look great there yet, but if we look at our sample, you can see our sample looks much more realistic. And before I adjust any of these settings, if I go ahead and do a quick render of that without any lighting, you'll find it won't really look like anything at all. You'll probably find it's just, there you go. It doesn't look too bad, but we can't really see the top. The specular might be a little bit too saturated, so we might need to decrease the values of that, but we need to put some kind of lighting in to see this. So I'll go ahead and put a physical sun and sky in. You might want to have a look at my tutorial in that if you haven't already seen it, just because I explained the physical sun and sky in a bit more detail. But I'll go ahead and put that in quickly in Window, Rendering Editors and Render Settings. And let's just open up my other screen. And in your render settings, go to Indirect Lighting, and then Physical Sun and Sky, click on Create. And like I said, have a look at my tutorial in that to learn more about the settings there. I'll just leave them at their default value for now. And if I re-render that, you should see that copper material really shows up quite nicely. It does take a little bit longer to render as soon as you put some kind of lighting in, and you'll find these Mir Material X default materials do take quite a while to render, so do be patient with it. Make sure your render settings and your render resolution are quite low. So that looks quite good. We can have a look at some of the other presets here as well. So if I click back on my object just to actually access my material, I click on bronze as I called it. I could rename it now if I want to. So let's say I want a chrome. I'll retitle it chrome just so I know. And I can go back to presets. And I've actually got a chrome one here as well. I want to replace all the old copper settings with chrome. And again, it doesn't look like much until we render it. There you go, it's reflecting that nice blue sky for us as well. You'll really need to play around with lighting too to get these materials right, but the physical sun and sky is good just to get the basics there. So I won't have time to go through all these different settings. There's quite a lot there. You'll really need to just experiment with them to see what you can get. And just have a look at these presets as well. There's lots of different ones on here. You've even got some plastics. So you've got a matte finish, a matte plastic, a pearl finish. Just experiment with them. And one last thing I'd like to show you. When you're learning about different materials, it's very easy to create materials that you don't necessarily want in the future. So for example, if I did right click on one of these and assign new material, let's say I give this a blin, and then I change my mind and I right click and I give it another material. And if I did that maybe 3 times, because this does happen, you experiment with materials and then you change your mind, you forget to title them, and before you know it, it takes forever for your scene to open. It's lagging, it crashes, and you're not sure why. It's because you've got loads of materials there that you're not using. Now, if I right click on this and go down to assign existing, you'll see you start to get a bit of a list here. I've got my blin 2, 3 and 4. There's not a lot there, but you could have hundreds of different materials just after maybe an hour or 2 of experimenting. And it's really easy to delete these. What we can do is now go to Window, Rendering Editors, and then Hypershade. And the Hypershade I'll explain a bit more in my ambient occlusion tutorial, but the Hypershade lets you actually access all of the materials. You've got your default Lambert 1, and you can see you've got all these other ones on here as well. You could, if you want to, select them from here, and then you can actually access all the attributes in your attribute editor, or you can delete them just by selecting them and pressing backspace. So I could delete my blin 2, 3 and 4 off of there because I'm not using them. Resave your scene and you'll find that can cure lots of problems. You'll find also, if I delete a material that I've already got assigned to an object, so for example my chrome is on this middle object here, if I delete that chrome material, you'll see you get a default green. Now that can be confusing if you have another object that is green. So if you want to delete a material that's already assigned, it's always good practice to put that default Lambert 1 back. So right click, assign existing material and just put your Lambert 1 back, then go ahead and delete that material. So there's quite a lot to take in, but just work with one at a time. Assign a new material, adjust the attributes, put some lighting in, even if it's just a physical sun and sky. Experiment until you're happy, save it, and then move on to your next object. Okay, so keep practicing, keep learning new things, keep making notes of your progress, screenshot as well if it helps, and remember to keep saving as you go.